This is a Squiz podcast. We're your shortcut to being informed.
G'day, I'm Kate Watson. Ben Smith is the former media reporter for the New York Times, political reporter for Politico, and a former editor-in-chief of BuzzFeed News. Semafor is his new media venture, and Mixed Signals is his weekly podcast. The reason I wanted to get Ben on is to talk about the upcoming US election. He's the perfect guest because for those who listened to our Newsmaker series, it flows on from that, with Ben able to give informed insights into the way the media is being used in this election, as well as commentary on the election itself. He's met both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris. I ask him about his impressions of them. He has stories of his time covering the election of Barack Obama and anecdotes about interactions with the Clintons. He also speaks about the experience of being in America during this time. I found Ben to be impressively articulate and very considered. Enjoy. When it comes to skincare, you shouldn't have to choose between the stuff that works and what you can afford. That's why we've partnered with Go-To. There's no baffling science, no fluff with Australia's go-to for skincare. Just seriously effective products that make your skin and wallet happy. Level up your routine at gotoskincare.com. Ben, welcome to what we think is your first Australian podcast. We're not going to absolutely hang our hat on that, but let's say that that's the case. You've said before, and I've heard you say quite a bit, that media is politics and politics is media. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, I think I would say that politics is the media business in particular. I don't think all media is politics, or should it be? But I do think contemporary politics, in a way that didn't used to be true, is really so much about media. You know, I mean, the old politics was meetings and backroom deals and small numbers of people who had information nobody else had. And I think to run a political campaign now is to produce images and videos and speeches and events in a way that is very much like the job of running a media company.
And this is why it's fascinating to have you on, because your experience really is at the junction between politics and media. Let's just start with your background as well. You wrote for the news outlet Politico from, I think, 2008 to 2011. You were then editor of BuzzFeed News, a reporter, then the media reporter at the New York Times. I thought about asking you sort of what job you enjoyed most, but I'm probably more interested in what gave you the most, particularly with a view to what you're doing now.
Oh, I mean, I've sort of been lucky to love everything I've done, and I've always just sort of chosen to do the thing that interested me. I mean, I started out, covering City Hall in New York, and I loved that. And I think I've sort of, in some sense, been lucky enough, just by sort of accident of how old I am. I'm 47, to have just kind of walked into journalism as the internet was changing everything, and being young enough to have realized, like, there had no choice but to sort of figure it out. And so started some blogs back when that was a new thing, and Politico in some sense was the professionalization of the old blogs. And then, felt social media sucking all the energy out of that old internet ecosystem. And BuzzFeed was an attempt to build a news organization on the back of social media. And so, but basically I've always loved reporting more than anything else.
BuzzFeed News doesn't exist anymore. How do you reflect on that?
I mean, it makes me really sad. And I think we made lots of business mistakes, but the core mistake was a bet about what social media was going to be like, and whether you could, whether there were sort of businesses to be built on the back of it. And I think we just, sort of fundamentally bet wrong, and there wasn't. But there were these very exciting moments. I mean, I remember going to Sydney and recruiting Mark DiStefano and Lane Santee and, great Australian journalists. And Australia was somehow better adapted to BuzzFeed than anywhere else in the world, because I'm trying to find a polite way to say this. I would say because the gap between high and low is perhaps slightly less wide than in other markets.
You can say that we're tiny. It's fine.
No. I wasn't trying to say that you were tiny. I was trying to say that you were that you don't have, I would say, I'm trying to say this in a positive way, not a very snobbish culture. I just remember, like, when we went to France, people just couldn't figure out, like, BuzzFeed, like because in France, like you can have the French low culture is the stupidest stuff in the world, and then high culture is very, very high, and they don't like the mixing of the things, and they don't like things in the middle. And in Australia, it just felt like, I remember Mark DiStefano did a Snapchat interview with your foreign minister that was all emoji or something, like immediately. And people in Australia just sort of like got that and liked it immediately. So we always felt very at home there. And they were just great, ambitious journalists there too. Guns, as you say.
It's funny, I was a political staffer when BuzzFeed, I think, was at its height, and the influence that BuzzFeed had, it was really real, and it did reach people that wouldn't have normally engaged with politics. And I think you've spoken about the success of the quiz and those kinds of things. I'm interested in the bet that was made that was wrong, because maybe just explain that a little bit, because then I want to ask you about what you're betting on now.
Yeah, the core bet, and it's a little bit of a business story, in a possibly boring way. But often after I wrote this book called Traffic about this whole ecosystem, one thing people asked me, which I probably should have written about a bit more in the book, was like, what the hell was anyone thinking giving you all this money? People invested big companies, wise business investors put hundreds of millions of dollars into BuzzFeed. And the answer is actually very specific. The people who invested in BuzzFeed and in Vice specifically had been people who made their money at MTV and at the birth of the cable era. And they were people who saw, wow, these entrepreneurs are laying wires in the ground and to connect people's houses to cable. And there's got to be something in them for anyone to pay for these cables. And if we can make content that is really well suited to this new medium, that can do things broadcast can't. It was more adult. It was, more narrowly focused. Lots of things that were different from broadcast gave you HBO and CNN and ESPN and MTV and these huge global brands. And the people who owned the wires made a lot of money, and the people who made the content for the wires made a lot of money. And it was sort of it was a symbiosis. And so come the internet and come social media, I think people looked at literally the same people. The chairman of BuzzFeed had been an MTV person. The chairman of Vice had been the founder of MTV, Tom Freston. Looked at these new wires at Facebook, at Snap, at Twitter, and said, oh, okay, these are the new wires. We're going to be the people who make the content for the wires. Everybody's going to get rich. Turned out only the people who owned the wires got rich this time because of user-generated content and various other things.
You've launched a new media business, Semafor, I think a couple of years ago now. I think you, nearly might be approaching 2 years. The objective is to solve the problem of polarization in media. Explain that and explain what you're betting on now.
In the early days of social media, I think we all felt like it was this incredible thing to have so much information, so many voices, so many perspectives, and outside voices, sort of to counteract and to question and to challenge and to correct these sort of staid and often, by the way, biased and wrong establishment media. And there was something just incredibly liberating and fun about it. I think 20 years later or 15 years later, we all feel totally overwhelmed by the amount of information that's coming our way, by the blending of news and opinion and advocacy, and like it's just disorienting. Even if you're a professional, it's just totally disorienting.
Yeah.
And I think the opportunity that we saw in terms of what people actually want is, they want a service that kind of distills things that tells them what's important and what's not important, that tells them what's fact and what's opinion. And by the way, that keeps the best of social media, which is, by the way, there are differing opinions. There are legitimate different points of view, and we're going to include multiple perspectives on shared facts. And so that's, like, I really think a lot of consumers and readers and listeners, enjoyed Twitter and Facebook for a while. But then at some point you catch on to this fact that they're reflecting back at you your own biases and at some level manipulating you by telling you what you want to hear. And like you all know people like that, right? Like that's not actually a good long-term relationship. And I think people have sort of caught on to that and are looking for alternatives. And you see that all over the place. I think the rise of podcasts actually, which are very often much less preachy and ideological and heated and much more an attempt, for better, and executed better and worse, but to actually provide some space for thought and opinion and argument and difference. But I think you see this. I think you see this all over media because I think a lot of it's actually what people want.
It's really interesting, I think, in the context of the current Murdoch case. We're obviously keenly interested in that here in Australia, and I'm sure you're watching it very closely too. But just to give the top line, because I want to ask you about this idea that you believe audiences are seeking out less polarization, less sort of reinforcement of their own views. And I know you're probably talking about a certain group of people, but I guess Rupert Murdoch, as the narrative goes, is making a bet on the fact that the way he set up his business in America, and particularly Fox News, will be best served by someone that will continue that legacy. And that legacy seems to be an assumption that Lachlan Murdoch will be as conservative, as right-wing as his father was editorially, and that the other siblings, Elizabeth Prudence and James, may not be. I guess my first question is, do you feel that assumption about Lachlan is correct, first of all?
Oh, for sure. I mean, Lachlan ran Fox through the Trump era, where they were very they basically swallowed what their reported distaste for Donald Trump to follow their audience into very kind of fervent support for him. Even and flirt, would flirt with alternatives, but ultimately their job is to reflect back to the American right what it wants, and what it wants is Donald Trump, and they're giving it to them.
And do you think that is a business decision that might be maybe, is your view that there's still going to be people that want that and there's going to be mass that want that? Or do you think there is a shift? Yeah.
When I say there's an audience that has gotten sick of that, it doesn't really include the sort of 70, age 70 and up Americans who love Fox News and watch it, of whom there are a couple million. I mean, it's a lot of people, but also it's a country of 350 million people. So, you can have a big business that isn't necessarily totally consuming the culture. But no, Fox is this incredibly cynical operation. And the Wall Street Journal is a great newspaper. I mean, I think that, Murdoch in some ways a very complicated legacy, which includes both these really cynical political operations and really great newspapers and things that are sometimes either in both.
I guess to your point, though, about their audience being older, 70 plus, what is the future then? What is when you're talking about people that are seeking out different points of view and are sick of this polarization, are they younger people? Are they who are they?
Yeah, I guess this is, we've obviously found an audience that tends to be more the people, the leaders in different fields who actually need and want real information, not need their own prejudices reaffirmed. And to some degree, that's our focus. And there will always also be fervent partisans who want their prejudices reaffirmed. And I'm sure that will always be a great business for Fox. Although they'll have to, my own guess is that they'll acquire Ben Shapiro's Daily Wire, because at some point they're just going to have to find, their audience is just dying, literally dying. And they're going to at some point need to find younger people. And so I assume they'll buy one of these sort of right-wing American startups. That's my total semi-informed prediction. But no, I think, I just think, I don't know, I'm optimistic about this. One of the things I actually sort of found interesting in terms of younger consumers is that a really predictable way for things to go viral on TikTok is when a host of a left-wing channel in the U.S. criticizes Kamala Harris, or a Fox News host criticizes Donald Trump. And I guess I sort of take that to mean that people have some lingering desire for voices that are not just purely partisan.
And I'm really interested in this idea, particularly in this election. Where do you think the most influence is coming from as far as media? What are the most influential channels when it comes to communicating with those who might be seeking to vote, have made up their minds and they're voting? Where are they getting their information?
So I have a sort of dodge here, which is that the real story of this U.S. election is fragmentation. Everything's getting split up, getting smaller. There are tons of smaller voices, smaller podcasts, smaller newsletters. And the smaller things are becoming medium-sized. The bigger things are getting smaller, but they're not. But still, the Fox News and the New York Times remain the biggest and most influential pieces of American political media, but they're both a little smaller and less influential than they were, and no single thing is rising up to replace them. What's rising up to replace them is lots of different things. It makes it very hard to understand what's happening. I would say TikTok is the biggest platform for these voices. Very hard to understand what's happening there. Is it, I think you saw this sort of incredible surge of interest and support for Kamala Harris that was certainly reflected on TikTok and seemed to be driven by it. But the platform is very, very opaque. You don't really know what's going on there. You just also don't know to what degree the people who own it are trying to put a thumb on the scale.
And I guess that's the conversation. We've obviously interesting to see Taylor Swift come out and endorse Kamala Harris. And in Chapel Roan just more recently has had that drama about not endorsing a certain candidate and then saying that she will be voting for Kamala Harris. The interesting thing about in Australia sitting and watching America is this intersection of celebrity and politics when it comes particularly to an election cycle, because we don't tend to have that here. We don't have celebrities endorsing candidates. We don't have celebrities lining up behind candidates. It sort of isn't a thing here, but it's such a thing in the US. How influential or not do you think that is?
They're not that influential. These people are well known, obvious. Nobody thought Taylor Swift was voting for Donald Trump.
Exactly.
I think they can help, but it's a big country, and it's, country with complicated election laws and lots of people who don't vote. And so like Taylor Swift's value here was to tell her young supporters, many of whom might be voting in the election for the first time, that you've got to sign up in advance. Like that's actually a very important technical thing. And so she did this big so it was a very technical thing for Harris. I mean, I think these are people with big platforms. They're not surprising anybody. I'm not sure they're changing minds, but our elections aren't that much about changing minds because, again, they're kind of low turnout. It's not in your country. Everybody goes and votes, and you have to move people around. For us, there are people who will make up their minds, but there's also a huge focus here on getting your base out, on getting your own supporters excited and turning them out. And it's a very, very polarized country. It's very fixed. It's funny. I was at the Democratic convention in Chicago and just happened to be watching it with a senior official in the Labour Party in Britain, and we were watching it together. And he said, it's funny, at our conventions we're very focused on the people who used to vote Labour and are now voting Tory and how to win them back. And it doesn't really seem like you're that interested in that. Your conventions, it doesn't seem like anyone's talking to those people. It's like, well, once in a while we get like there's like a police officer speaking about Kamala Harris trying, but that's not really the focus.
How do they, though, I guess, if it is going to be a close election, which, I mean, I think we always say this here, take it with a grain of salt what the polls are saying, take it with a grain of salt what the commentary's saying, but everyone is saying that it could be really close. It could come down to, a matter of votes in some places. How do you reach those people that are sort of sitting somewhere in the middle?
It is incredible, right, to think about like who has not made up their mind, like who are these people? And honestly, it is people once in a while. Like I remember, you run into somebody who's like, wait, is Donald Trump running for president again? That's crazy. It's like last week. So I don't know. It's people.
Where were you?
I was in Maine, the state of Maine.
Right.
Not a swing state, actually. But yeah, you run into people who don't really care about politics and don't pay much attention, and don't want to. And I mean, it's kind of nothing wrong with that in a certain way. And so, the main way they try to reach those people is, I mean, for all the talk of new media, they're going to be spending literal billions of dollars on television advertising. And so when you sit on your couch to watch an American football game, as I did last night, just like back to back, and I'm in New York, right? I don't know why I'm seeing this stuff, but the Harris ad says that she's going to lower your gas prices and your grocery prices and stand for the middle class because she worked at McDonald's when she was a kid. And the Trump ad has pictures of Kamala Harris with drag queens and says that she is for they, them, and he is for you. So that's just like a night of watching American football.
What is the experience for the American public of the next sort of 5 weeks as we head towards an election? Like, how much is it? How can you avoid it? Can you avoid it?
I mean, the experience is a national nervous breakdown. I mean, it's just totally nuts. It's, people feel a lot of, I think, anxiety and paranoia, and supporters of both candidates, I think, are very stressed about it. Yeah, it's a very strange, and I think for journalists, I think American policy is fascinating to write about and is very interwoven with journalism in a way, and journalism can have a lot of effect on it when it's months and years away. But I always think of it as sort of a meteor kind of approaching the Earth, and by October of the election year, all you can really do is just point and scream.
If you're after skincare that works but without the sticker shock, we're right there with you. That's why we're stoked to have GoTo Skincare as a podcast partner on News Club. With GoTo, you get all the good stuff. We're talking potent, effective ingredients without the hefty price tag. No compromises, just happy skin. Level up your routine at gotoskincare.com. You covered the 2008 election where Barack Obama was elected against John McCain. How much has it changed? How is it so different to back then?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, I think one of the things about the 2008 election that you don't always know at the time what's going to, what points to the future. And I think we all thought the point of the 2008 election in the end, Barack Obama's one of his powerful lines was just that it was time to turn the page on the divisive fights of the 20th century, that turn the page on the baby boomers, actually, was sort of what he meant. Just like these people are still fighting about the Vietnam War, like what even, these are old people fighting about old stuff. Let's just move on. Like we don't have to resolve those fights. We can just move on into the future. And I think there was a sense of like, okay, this is a real generational shift in America toward a more diverse country with more diverse coalitions, a different kind of leadership style. And just frankly, younger leaders. That turned to be totally wrong, right? Like Barack Obama is still the youngest person who, like no one anywhere remotely. Barack Obama is still way younger than Joe Biden, Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton, who was nominated after him. And so, and instead, the sort of avatar of that election that really, I think, now dominates American politics is Sarah Palin, this kind of flaky vice presidential candidate who John McCain picked out of nowhere and who was widely viewed as being totally unqualified, but had this sort of intuitive, populist, anti-establishment edge that made her the purest precursor of Donald Trump.
Have you met Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
I've met Trump in passing and have met Harris a few times, yeah.
What are they like?
Trump, and again, I really very passing experience. So based on my colleagues who know him much better, is in person much smarter and more charming and engaging than he sort of performs, and is a very capable performer, obviously. I mean, Harris is interesting. I first met her when she was a California politician in 2009 or 10 who was thinking about starting to sort of make her way into Washington. I was sort of a mid-tier Washington reporter, and they decided to try her out on me. And so I was her first DC interview. And I remember she was very smart about law enforcement questions because she was the California Attorney General. And when I started asking her about matters of national politics, she was just totally unfamiliar with them. I remember thinking like, oh, she's like the Justice Minister of Poland or something. Like California is its own country. She's a major, major political figure in a different country, and clearly incredibly talented and smart, but also really from a different place and kind of unfamiliar with American national politics to a surprising degree. And I do think part of what's hard to see from the outside about her is that while she's in her late 50s, she really only came to Washington when she was 53. So she's kind of a newcomer to national American politics. And meanwhile, California is it's another country. Politics there work differently. It's too big to have retail politics and to shake hands. So what they do is there's a lot of sort of quiet positioning yourself to be chosen by the power elite and ingratiating yourself to rich people. And like those are the two big skills that you learn in California politics, which are different. And a kind of televised performance, which she's very good at. But I think you saw these skills come in particularly when it felt like suddenly like Biden's out and it's wide open. And suddenly it's not wide open because every member of the Democratic power elite had, unbeknownst to us, spent 6 years being avidly courted by Kamala Harris for this very moment. So it turned out that like Hillary Clinton thought she was Kamala Harris's best friend. Like no one knew that. But Harris had been very assiduously kind of courting all of the internal power bases in a way that was invisible from the outside and very much a feature of where she came up.
Fascinating stuff. What a great insight into those two people. What does 2025 look once we've got through this election? What does it look like over there? I guess you can take any lens you want, but what are your expectations of, regardless of the result, I guess?
I think the different results are pretty different. I mean, I think Trump has a very ambitious domestic policy agenda centered on immigration that will be incredibly divisive, and depending on how aggressive he is, bring people into the streets in large numbers, or not. I mean, I think there's and I think Harris has a very unambitious domestic policy agenda, shaped by the fact that Joe Biden came in, thought he was Franklin Delano Roosevelt to reshape the whole economy, kind of was seen as overreaching. And so her agenda is very much about we're gonna try to pass a $6,000 a person child tax credit, like a popular policy that would arguably make parents' lives easier and raise taxes. But it's also very negotiable. Like it's certainly a policy she can bring to Congress, and Republicans will say, well, what about $2,000? But also you cut taxes this way. It's, these are very kind of Bill Clinton style, negotiable, modest, popular policies that she's talking about. And I think one really interesting feature is that unlike a lot of our sort of peer countries, the U.S. economy is very strong right now, and growing, creating jobs, unemployment is low, interest rates are going down. And so there's a pretty decent chance that whoever is elected inherits one of the great economies and takes credit for it. And so there's sort of a Trump boom or a Harris boom that they get to take credit for, which is one of the strange ironies of politics.
What about globally? How does it look depending on who wins?
I mean, Trump is, I think it's complicated because I think Trump both is more, is very reluctant to engage the U.S. abroad and is skeptical of particularly NATO and, U.S. support for Europe. And meanwhile, supportive of Israel, but hates Benjamin Netanyahu and also doesn't want to engage U.S. troops in that region. And also is legitimately viewed as kind of scary and unpredictable by American adversaries, which can be a real advantage. And so I think it's not totally obvious what happens. I do think, obviously, the Russians are hoping that Trump, the Russians are hoping that Trump wins. The Ukrainians are hoping he loses. I was in Saudi Arabia recently, and they kind of can't decide which they're hoping for. It's a complicated picture. I think not as obvious. I think that what you typically see is more continuity in U.S. foreign policy than you think. Right. And I think that's what you've seen through the years. And I do think that, Trump is talking a big game about huge tariffs. I think if you see the U.S. economy growing the way it's growing right now, and I'm skeptical that he's actually going to want to come in and tank the stock market.
Harris as president on the global stage?
I mean, continuity, right? I mean, I think, support is sort of, pained, partial support for Israel, but no real interest in picking a fight over it and being defined by it, this sort of long continuing attempt to pivot to Asia and to focus on the U.S.-China relationship. And certainly more support for Ukraine against Russia. But honestly, I think in both of those cases, it's about the shape of what a peace deal that emerges there and the exact outlines of it.
Perhaps we can talk to you again in 2025 and see where we're at. I want to get back to the relationship between politics and media, though. I want to finish with an anecdote you told on your podcast, Mixed Signals. It's a podcast I highly recommend to anyone interested in media. I listen to it each and every week. But this week you told a story about when you were having dinner, I think, and forgive me if I tell this incorrectly, you can correct me, but and Bill Clinton came over to you and made a joke, which I think the joke is not particularly relevant to the story, but you could have written a story about it. It was a little bit of a yarn. It wouldn't have broke the world, but it was a bit of a yarn. You tell the story then that you went to the bathroom to write it down, came back out, and Hillary Clinton's press secretary, because this was during her campaign period for president, came out and said, "Look, can you not write that story? And in exchange, I will give, you can have dinner with the Clintons right now." You say you regretted the decision to have dinner with the Clintons and not write the story. So you better tell us what the story is. But I'm interested in whether this is how it works. Like, is this, I think people are really interested in how it actually works when it comes to interacting with not just, I guess, the candidates themselves, but their staff and their press secs and their strategy.
Yeah, it's funny. That was, I mean, honestly, like my own view is that access is a curse, and I've mostly not been the kind of reporter who traded for access or cared about access. And I totally thought I made a mistake, but it was like, as you say, it was like a stupid yarn and didn't feel that valuable. And I didn't, to sort of sell my soul for, but it is just sort of an instance of something I really try not to do and do regret. But it was a funny story at the time, which is Rudy Giuliani was riding really high and seemed likely to be the nominee, and Bill Clinton. And it was after a kind of LGBT debate, and I was having dinner with two gay donors at this LA hotel, and Clinton knew them and came over to talk to them, and I think didn't realize I was a journalist, and said that once the hillbillies of Arkansas and West Virginia realized that Rudy Giuliani's first wife was his second cousin, he was going to carry those states easily. It was funnier when he told the joke, but but it would have been like a 2-hour scandal, and instead I had a unmemorable, and I'm sure for them, painful dinner with Hillary Clinton. Honestly, very rarely are you offered a transaction that's crude.
what I was. I guess that's what I was curious
But it was
about.
kind of the dumbest thing in the world, and so what? It's not like I wasn't burying Watergate, but I think there is a. Rarely is it that crude, but honestly, why do some reporters get a certain kind of press release and a certain kind of announcement to write? Because the people making the announcement understand that there's an implicit deal, that they'll write it, they'll cover it from the perspective of and with a sort of favorable spin of the person giving it to them, and that's basically what you'd call access journalism, and. The trade-offs it's not always crystal clear and it's not explicit, but if you are a real softball journalist, you are more likely to get a certain kind of story because the source has a choice about where they go with it. And if you are reflexively cynical and negative, you'll never get certain stories, but you shouldn't be reflexively cynical and negative either. You should be fair. And I have always thought, that you should not, that it's not worth it. It's just not worth that much. It's not worth as much as it seems like. The good stories are the ones somebody didn't want you to tell.
How would an audience know? I think, as someone, and we're talking to those people who you've identified are, sick of the polarization, keen for factual information, keen to probably read stuff from journalists that aren't trading in that way. How do we know? How can we tell?
It's a really good question. And I think journalists, ultimately, you have to hold people accountable to telling the truth. And I think there is a spectrum of the prime minister chose to give this big interview not to, what's her name, Sarah Ferguson? Is that your very tough television broadcaster?
7:30,
maybe he didn't choose her. He chose somebody else because he's afraid of her, rightly. And does that necessarily mean that other person is totally corrupt and a sellout? No. But it does sort of reflect well on her in a certain way. But she also would have liked to get the interview. I would say it's complicated. And I think that there's sort of a mistake in imagining that journalism is this absolutely cut and dry thing where you can just say, here's the calculus, here's the math. In fact, it's a social practice. It's complicated. It exists in the context of politics and of society. And, the best you can do is try to sort of understand everybody's incentives, but rarely are any of them totally pure and perfect. But I do think good journalists see their job as taking information that does, finding information that isn't otherwise out there and bringing it to people and trying to put it honestly in context.
Ben, thank you so much for your time. I so appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on.
As I said, Ben Smith is the founder of Semafor. A link to that site is in your show notes. If you enjoyed this conversation, please leave a review or tell your mates. Or if you want to get in touch, my email is kate@thesquiz.com.au. Also, a good chance to let you know that we'll have a special US election series rolling out on our Squiz Today show from tomorrow. It's for those of you who don't want to tune into every twist and turn, but want to stay across the main bits. Elections are our game here at The Squiz, and we want to make sure that you feel informed enough to have smart conversations about the news. Thanks for listening. I'll be back next week with another interview across the main bits. Thanks for tuning in.